Hi, I'm Hanne Larsen, and in the following I'll briefly discuss some of the major characteristics of Danish culture and the Danes, as seen by ourselves, by researchers and by people doing business with us. The lecture is not intended to include a comprehensive account of Danish national identity and Danish history. Instead, it aims at pinpointing certain characteristics which we need to keep in mind when communicating with people from a different culture. Please consider the following points for a couple of minutes, and if possible, share with your colleagues. What do you find characterizes a Dane? What would you tell others about Danish culture? What do you find to be typically Danish at your workplace? And have you ever experienced that your Danishness has created problems? Why should we not just study other cultures, but also look into our own culture? Well, a way to begin growing cultural competences is to see the way culture shapes what we see, what we think, and what we do. This means understanding the cultural center of ourselves. As we become aware of how our own behavior is shaped by culture, and of how others are likely to perceive us because of our cultural background, then we can begin to take this into account when communicating with people from other cultures. As mentioned earlier, those who are culturally self-aware can more readily escape the mistake of assuming that others are just like us and of trying to communicate with them according to our own values, beliefs, and norms. Actually, several surveys show that Danes in general lack self-awareness. This means that we are unaware of our views of people from other cultures, and we lack knowledge of why we feel insulted or outraged at others. This makes us tend to idealize some and unconsciously look down on others. For instance, we often think about people outside of Europe that they cannot meet our standards of punctuality and quality, but we feel that we must behave properly even though we find ourselves to be more rational than they are. We often think that the others need to adapt to our ways of doing things. We do not understand or think about why we react in certain ways because our reactions tend to be automatic instead of based on knowledge. And we lack awareness of what seems natural to us may not be so to others. I'd like you to take a look at this example that reads like this. In general, the Danes are very open towards other cultures, compared to Asia and the Middle East, where they are very reserved and cautious. We are very productive and committed. We often invite home people, whereas other cultures are more businesslike and meet at hotels. Compared to others, I find that Danes are more humorous, if one may say so. This quotation, made by an experienced salesperson in a Danish medium-sized company, tells us that lack of reflection and self-awareness may lead us to stereotype others and idealize our own culture. I think that most people who are familiar with Danish culture will agree that, contrary to what is said here, the Danes are often seen as being rather reserved compared to other cultures. What do researchers and non-Danes then say about us? In the following, I'll touch upon some of the characteristics that make us stand out. These are equality, trust, independence, punctuality, directness and formality, privacy, conflict management, humor, religion, and self-perception. In Denmark, we're deeply committed to cooperation and equality from early childhood. Based on our society's egalitarian values, we have been taught not to boast about our achievements and to dislike people who openly flash status or success. But when doing business with other more masculine and hierarchical cultures, we must remember to promote our qualities much more than we're used to at home. This also goes for Danish businesswomen who must remember to upgrade their business cards and bring a fat expense account to convince the counterpart of their power. In Denmark we also dislike being told directly what to do. Of course, this also affects business life, as employees are expected to do their jobs without close supervision, and managers tend to phrase instructions more as guidance or suggestions. This indirect approach works fine in Denmark, but it tends to cause great confusion outside of Scandinavia because employees in hierarchical cultures expect clear, straightforward direction. Please take a look at this case. The supervisor Benny from a Danish engineering company traveled to Texas to instruct his American colleagues in maintenance. Benny is to train Bill, who asks, "So I guess you're an expert on this?" Benny smiles and shyly answers that his skills are not that bad and that he is sure they'll be doing fine. Bill doesn't look very content, which Benny ignores. Bill finds Benny too slow and says that he wants to speed up to get his bonus. Benny replies that it's important to be careful and that this is no competition. This makes Bill lose his temper and exclaim, "To be honest, I'd prefer to have somebody come and give me proper training instead of some second-rate blacksmith." This real-life case clearly demonstrates that Danes must learn to promote their skills and expertise. When working in masculine cultures, we shouldn't depreciate ourselves, but stress our qualities as often as possible to build trust. International surveys show that the Danes are some of the most trusting people in the world. The Danes have faith not only in each other, but also in the justice system, the police, and the state administration. The explanation for this degree of trust can be found in a number of places, both in Denmark's long history as a culturally homogeneous people and in our egalitarian and high-quality welfare state. When doing business with other cultures, we must keep in mind that this approach may seem a bit naive, as it shows in this quotation by a German working in Denmark, who said, "When calling in sick, you usually don't have to give the boss a doctor's sick note, not even if you stay ill all week." Danes are taught to be independent from early childhood. This is rooted in the school system and in the egalitarian culture, which leads us to lack respect for authorities, to feel obliged to speak our minds, and to dislike aggressive sales tactics and dictatorial management styles. Danes consider these qualities to be evidence of initiative and independence, but we must keep in mind that business people coming from more hierarchical cultures might find that if subordinates act on their own, this may demonstrate lack of management and structure in a company. In Denmark, we're monochronic and focus a lot on deadlines, tasks, and schedules. This also means that we find that by being punctual, we're bound to be productive and efficient. We must keep in mind that this may seem impersonal and inflexible to other cultures, since most people around the world are more polychronic than we are. By gaining a better understanding of the reasons for our personal frustration when people are late or tasks have not been finished on time, we may be able to temper some of the frustration by redefining productivity in relational terms when working in more relationally driven cultures. With a heightened sense of awareness, we may go beyond merely being frustrated and seek to understand what's behind it. The interesting thing is that even though Danes in general consider themselves to be efficient, studies among expats working in Denmark show that quite a lot find decision-making in Danish companies to be slow due to the democratic decision-making process. This quotation has been included to picture what I mentioned earlier, namely that some Danes stereotype other cultures and glorify themselves due to the lack of self-awareness and lack of knowledge of others and other cultures. As Danes, we're often unaware that we tend to be very direct and informal communicators, which may seem offensive to foreigners coming from more hierarchical cultures. Even in business meetings, we often leave the small talk for later and get straight to the heart of the subject. We also find it normal to make direct contact in business with people we don't know yet, and may forget that in many other cultures we are expected to make a more indirect approach, for example, to be introduced by a third party. we must keep in mind that it can be considered very offensive to get straight to the point. Therefore, we may learn from more indirect communicators that it sometimes pays out to express oneself in more ambiguous terms to prevent the counterpart from losing face. To avoid seeming rude or arrogant, we should also remember to continuously use the word please, a word which we often forget because there is no word for please in Danish. By way of example, I'd like you to take a look at this quotation by an Indian employee in Denmark. The Danes can be very impolite. They're more straightforward than the Norwegians. Now that I know how it's meant, I simply ignore it. I hadn't experienced such behavior before. It came as a shock to me. The Danes are a strange mix of being very open and direct and yet very private. We expect the welfare state to take care of us, but at the same time object against having anybody set up rules for us or interfere with our private lives. We don't mind walking around in public wearing little clothes, but according to several surveys, we are not very interested in getting to know people from other cultures. Even though Danes in general are considered to be welcoming to foreigners in business life, we tend to keep our work life separate from our private life, as opposed to relationship-focused cultures. Foreigners often comment that we lead a very planned life and do not merely drop by friends for dinner or invite home business associates, which makes us look distant and reserved. In this case mentioned here, this feeling that I just mentioned is expressed by a European businessman working in Denmark who said, "It came as a shock that nobody invited me home. There's no spontaneity. We're having a barbecue today. Come and join us. In my home country, we would never arrange a dinner 3 weeks ahead. I'd never seen a family calendar till I moved to Denmark." As mentioned earlier, equality ranks high in Denmark, and this leads us to be consensus-oriented in many situations. From early childhood we're taught to be individualistic, but at the same time we're afraid of not being accepted by the group. The result is that many Danes dislike direct confrontation and seek consensus through detailed discussion. And so dissatisfaction is often expressed indirectly, for instance through irony and sarcasm, which can be very difficult to understand for people coming from other cultures. Humor is often used as a communication tool in Denmark. We use it to make fun of authorities, of management, and perhaps of ourselves. But we must be careful, as humor does not travel easily across cultures, and especially not irony and sarcasm, which risk being misunderstood. Some might find that we lack dignity acting this way, whereas we would probably just claim that we are capable of ignoring personal criticism. But we should take into account that in many other cultures you can much more easily lose face than you can in Denmark. Danish society is often perceived as the most secularized in the world, even though Danish mentality and our institutions are greatly influenced by Christianity, as can be seen for instance in our work ethics. And religion plays a minor role to most of us. Actually, you might say that religion is almost taboo in Denmark, and it's certainly not something you discuss with other people. For instance, in the USA it would be a natural thing for people to ask you directly which church you belong to. As Danes we might feel offended by such a question, and therefore we must remember to be respectful about how we discuss our religious beliefs or lack of religious beliefs, and we must be attentive towards the effect of religious values on the business, management and marketing decisions in a particular culture. It's also worth noticing that even though the Danes pride themselves of being modest, we also possess a feeling of superiority on behalf of the small nation and its own Danish culture. And this can partly be explained by our country's long existence as a sovereign state and the many military defeats, which has resulted in a national culture and identity that combines self-confidence with apparent humility. The same traditions have had a strong influence on behavior in the workplace and Danish management traditions. So we shouldn't forget about that. But internationally, we should keep in mind that it might be rather tiring listening to Danes who perceive themselves as being intellectually superior to others. This is sometimes displayed in EU contexts, where Danish companies and politicians complain of being forced to follow the other members' low level. A minor detail might be our use of the flag, which is often confusing to foreigners who find it nationalistic and self-centered. In most other countries, the consistent use of the flag is considered bad taste or a political statement, and that the flag should be treated with more respect than we do in Denmark. This means that we have to tell people from other cultures what the flag means to us, and especially what it does not mean when we put flags on the cake, on the Christmas tree, the shop windows, in the yard, and that to us the flag means celebration and a sense of community. What then make Danish companies stand out compared to those in other cultures, and consequently where do Danes have to make an extra effort? It has often been said that foreign business people appreciate our informal and laid-back behavior, but we should also realize that sometimes this may backfire, since it could make it difficult for us to gain respect. In Denmark, there is still a stricter distinction between work time and social time than in most other countries, but we should keep in mind that this is opposed to the mindset in many other cultures where it would, for instance, not be acceptable for a male manager to leave a meeting at 4 p.m. because he has to go and pick up his children in the nursery. In general, Danes are said to be slow to make contact and to open up. Consequently, we have to learn to small talk and to take time to get to know our business associates. As mentioned earlier, our direct communication patterns, when taken into a second language, can be somewhat problematic to cultures more used to a diplomatic approach to communicating in business. Plain speaking and being frank are signs of respect in our culture, and this directness can sometimes be mistaken as rudeness in cultures where diplomacy is more important than being frank. Now that you've gained insight into both your own and other cultures, you need to combine the knowledge with the values of your workplace. Here I've used the company Marel and their values to illustrate the point, but no matter which company you represent, you will benefit from making such considerations. Based on the outcome of your discussion that I suggest you have with colleagues, management will then be able to develop a strategy for cultural encounters at your workplace. I suggest that you discuss whether your values may be interpreted differently by non-Danes than by Danish employees and business associates. Where might you expect problems? And how can you build a common understanding of your values across cultures? To back up the discussion, you may also consider which visible and non-visible attitudes that are predominant in your company. And you may consider what can be and should be improved, as well as how and why. Thank you for your attention.